say, well, I'm just a secretary. I just clean buildings. I'm not anything significant. And Paul's saying it doesn't matter whether the culture thinks you're significant or not. I think what you're doing is significant. Your work, even if it doesn't have eternal value, has eternal implications. Okay? Some people think, well, I got to be a doctor, or I got to be a minister. I got to be in ministry in order to have an eternal impact in somebody else's life. And the truth of the matter is, you don't have to have a job that has eternal value in order to have an eternal impact, because everything that you do in your job right now, this very day, has eternal implications, whether you believe it or not. Everything you do. And when you embrace that truth, when you begin to, instead of being conformed to the pattern of this world, you're transformed by the renewing of your mind when it comes to your vocational health. When you embrace this truth, it changes everything. You believe that? You believe what Scripture is saying in this text? If you believe it, then what looks differently in your workplace tomorrow? What do you do? How do you relate to your boss differently? What different kind of relationship will you have with your employees? Will you get there early or will you get there late? Will you lie when it comes to how much you worked and whether you did this? Will you take credit for ideas that were not your own? No, because you're beginning to think about your work not in terms of, am I doing it for my boss or my earthly employers, but I'm doing it for the Lord. Look at what he says. Here's the bottom line. Into verse 24. Knowing that from the Lord you're going to receive an inheritance as your reward, you are serving the Lord Christ. In case you don't get it, everything you do, paid, unpaid, stay-at-home mom, never-at-home dad, culturally respectable or not, retired or not, part-time, full-time, doesn't matter. You're working, whatever you're doing, you're serving the Lord Christ. This earth, your job is a stewardship. It's temporary. And you're accountable for everything. You're not going to go to heaven because you did a good job in the workplace. You're not saved by works. You're saved by grace. But every single thing you do in this body, at your workplace, you will give an account. You'll stand before the Lord. And what will you say? And what will He say? Will you be found trustworthy for kingdom responsibility? What would you do different if you believe this to be true? And will you do it? Will you be transformed in your work? Your work. How you work is more important than where you work. Who you work for, you're not working for man, but you're working for the Lord. And when you do work the way God's commanding us to do work, here's the coolest part. Here's why you should do this. When you do your work the way God's asking us to do our work, then you're actually inviting God's blessing onto your job. You want God's blessing on your marriage? Then do marriage the way God says do marriage. If you want God's blessing on your finances, then do your finances the way God says to do your finances. You want God's blessing on your emotional health and mental health and your relationships, then begin to do as God says. But in order to do as God says, you've got to begin to see as God sees. And when you do what God says when it comes to your workplace, because your mind's been renewed and you're thinking about your work differently, you're actually inviting God's blessing onto your job. That's the best thing you can do for your career. The very best thing you can do. It liberates you. I'm not held captive to what my culture thinks about my job. It doesn't matter what people may think. All this stuff is temporary. This life is a test. Someday I'm going to stand before the Lord for the real deal, the real McCoy, the eternal responsibility, and I'll be found faithful. It changes everything.